Tonight we're in Psalm chapter 62, and we don't always know what the background is, but from the context, we know that David again is being opposed by his enemies. And in this case, his enemies are really scoundrels. They're deceitful, underhanded, and they're conspiring against him. And so that's always challenging when you got those kind of people in your life. I think that the key verse, and I just want to focus on this for just a moment, is in verse 8 and verse 10. Notice in verse 8, excuse me, uh, David says, trust in him at all times. And sometimes it's difficult to trust in him. It's academic, I think, when things are going well. You can say you trust the Lord, but when there's difficulty and adversity, sometimes that can be trying. And so David, though, was saying, trust in the Lord at all times. And we really need to trust the Lord when we're in some of those deep valleys in life. But notice he'll say, trust in the Lord at all times. And what he's doing in this verse is encouraging others, not just himself, but others to do what he does. That is to trust in the Lord. Now, notice he'll say, pour out your heart before him. God is his refuge for us. And then he uses that little word, Selah, which means we're to stop and ponder and give some thought to what was just said. Now, in verse number 10, there's a contrast about trust. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about trust, we're simply saying faith. And what we mean by faith here is not simply to believe academically, but we're talking about a faith that has confidence and trust in God. In contrast to what David had just said in verse number 10, he'll say, "Not trust not in oppression." Evidently, these people were cruel and underhanded, and their gain was by oppression, and become vain or empty in robbery. So you see the kind of people that we're dealing with: violent men, thieves, and who are just slippery kind of people. Now, notice he'll say, "If riches increase, set not your heart on them." Now, I want to give some thought on this. Think about this for a moment. Did you trust God more when you had just two dresses and one pair of shoes to wear? It's a kind of a strange thing sometimes when riches increase, as David said here, that we set our heart upon them and we put our trust in them. And what I'm saying is sometimes, when we are without much, we have more dependence upon God. And there's kind of a thing here that happens that when you start having abundance and you have position and you have power and you have money, if you're not careful, man has a tendency to start trusting in them. And so that's why I simply asked, why did you trust God more when you just had a few coins in your pocket, when you were just starting out in life, and this life moves along in this journey as your riches increase? Have you put your trust in that kind of security? And what David is saying here, don't do that. Put your trust in God at all time, and don't be like a lot of folks see as they move along in life and they begin to accumulate things, that whether it's money or power or whatever you want to throw in that bag, you begin to trust in that stuff. Now, we'll see why David puts his trust in God always. So we begin in Psalm 61. It's a short psalm, but there's some good thoughts in it. Notice he'll say, "Truly my soul waiteth." Now, I want you to think about how this connects with faith. When we think of faith, oftentimes we think faith is demonstrated by our acts. And certainly that's true. James says faith without works is dead. And so there are times where faith calls upon us to act, and our faith is demonstrated by our actions. So faith without works is dead. A guy that just says he has faith, James says, is very suspicious of that whole kind of business. Now, but there are times when faith just simply waits. And that can be challenging, because when you have to wait for God to act, you can become discouraged. And as a matter of fact, while you're waiting, you might not only become discouraged, but you might lose your faith. And in our society, in our culture, we have a very difficult time in waiting. We want everything now. We're not used to waiting. We think if we have to wait, we're being underhanded in some way. And so we don't like to wait at the doctor's office or wait in line for anything. And so what I'm saying, sometimes it's very challenging for us simply to wait. And so waiting can, waiting sometimes can cause us to become discouraged and lose hope and lose faith and have no confidence. So David says, that I will wait. And I want to challenge you on that. God doesn't always answer your prayer on the same hour. And sometimes you have to wait a long time for that prayer to be answered. And so David said, my soul waiteth and upon God. And he goes on to say, from him cometh my salvation or deliverance. He's not speaking about, our salvation from sin or being saved from being lost. But David is referring to be delivering out of some kind of adverse circumstance. Now, notice in verse 2, he says, he alone. Now notice this, and I mentioned a little bit about this earlier today. David understands that ultimately God is his salvation and God is his refuge and God is his strength. And David is not relying on his position or who he is or anything like that. And he understands that God alone is his salvation and his fortress, and that's what he has faith in. That's what he's relying in. And so it really is challenging, I think, to where we just kind of narrow everything down and say, I'm going to wait on God alone. I'm going to put my faith in God alone. And we're not talking about never doing anything, just sitting under the apple tree. But sometimes you just have to have your faith in God alone. And so David isn't forcing a situation. He's not relying on anybody else, but he understands whatever the trying circumstance is, and it seems to be one that's really trying because they're trying to do him in. They're trying to get rid of him. They're trying to kill him. And so David, you see, is relying on the Lord, and he's saying, I'm relying on you alone. Think about praying like that. I'm praying to God and say, God, it's up to you. Only you can save me. Only you can get me out of this mess. And I'm depending on you alone to do it. I think that's a great prayer, don't you? Now notice again, he'll say, he only is my rock. Of course, a rock is a fortress. A rock is what you can stand on, or we might say it's an anchor. But a rock gives you stability. When you're standing on the rock, you see, you have security and you have trust. And so he's saying, he alone, that is God alone, is my rock and my salvation. And let me again just say this because we're talking about the Psalms, and the Psalms were prayers. David is very poetic in the prayer, and David, of course, is also trying to communicate this to others, and they would use it in the worship service, as we've said many, many times. And so think about where he says he's my defense, and you're praying to God. You're saying, God, you're my defense, you're my fortress, and I'm relying on you alone to deliver me. Now, how long will you imagine mischief? Now, that little phrase there, it's interesting to me because you're going to see in the context what he says, how long he's addressing his enemies. And what he's saying pretty much is simply this: how long are you going to persist in your foolishness? And we kind of think that sometimes. How long are you going to persist in something that just makes absolutely no sense at all? You're persisting in something that's going to ultimately fail. And so sometimes you look out there that people are persisting in their stubbornness or in their stupidity, and you just wonder, how long are you going to keep this up? That's what David is saying here in verse 3. How long will you, speaking to the enemies again, will you imagine mischief, King James, against a man And David reminds them, and you're going to see a little further down in the verses here why he says this, but he's saying to them, in your persistence of what you're doing, in your opposition to God, what's going to happen is you're all going to be slain. You're all going to die. That's what he says. You shall be slain, all of you, as a bowing wall shall be in a tottering fence. Notice verse 4. Here is why I said that these folks are slippery and they're scoundrels, they're underhanded and they're deceitful. And David knows that. David knows that he's dealing with those kind of people. So he says in verse 4, they only consult to cast him down from his lofty place, King James excellent. They delight in lies. And notice what he says, they bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly. So, they come before David and they're acting like, they're on his side, and really they're trying to do him in. And they speak all these words of blessing. Some guys can use some flattery pretty good, and they can, you might sound after talking to them, boy, these guys are on my side, but they're not. And David says they bless with their mouths, but in their hearts they curse. Now, verse number 5 again, and the reason that David does it is David will repeat some things, and sometimes that's good for us to remember, simply to emphasize. And here's what he says: my soul waiteth upon only on God, for my expectation is from him. Now, the word expectation, of course, that means we're anticipating something. That's what hope is. I mean, hope means that we're anticipating, we're expecting something. It's not wishy-washy hope. I just kind of hope it happens. But David here is anticipating. In fact, the word that's used for waiting in these verses is to eagerly wait. He's waiting in an eager sense, expecting God to intervene for him and to act. And that gives you the idea of waiting. It's not waiting in hopelessness, but it's waiting, you see, with the anticipation that God is going to act. And really, when you get into Romans 8, that's our hope. We believe that God is going to save us. We have the expectation that we'll spend eternity with him in heaven. We have the hope that he's forgiven us of our sins. And so we look forward to that. That's what hope does. It looks forward. Now notice verse number 6. Again, he says this: he is my rock, my salvation, my defense. And notice, because God is, now that's David's confidence, but because he has that kind of confidence, David said, I will not be moved. And keep in mind, in spite of all that's going on around him. Notice verse number 7, and we're moving quickly, but we need to, don't we? Verse number 7. In God is my salvation. You see the repetitiveness, and David's not just trying to be redundant. He's not just filling in words, but he's emphasizing that God is his rock, that God is his salvation and his defense. And also he is my glory, my rock, my strength, my refuge, my place of safety, and it is God. Number 8, and we mentioned this just a moment ago, trust in him at all times. And I just want to stress that again, that no matter what's going on in your life, and I know that there's some times that are very difficult to deal with, things that we have to struggle with, and all kind of problems that we're faced with, and they can be very discouraging. And but I want you to see that in those times, especially, that you continue to keep your hope and your trust in the Lord. Now, then he goes on to say, and by the way, you see that little Selah there? That's the second time David uses it. And I'm reading through these rather rapidly, but those are pauses. And the idea, again, to pause is to meditate on that, give some thought to it about that. And so you have to ask yourself, when you're going through some difficult times, put that little Selah there and begin to ponder about your trust in God. Now, in verse number 9, and here he's going to speak about all kinds of men, whether men in low position or high position, but he's going to say men of low degree. These are people in humble situations, as vanity, and those that are high in high degree, or he says is a lie. In other words, it's pretentious, it's empty, there's nothing to it. And what he's basically saying in these verses, they're balanced and all together is lighter than vanity. He's just saying, your hope in man is nothing. And really, only God is the one that you can really trust in. And you'll see why he'll say this, because down in verse 11, he'll mention two things. And I want to go back to this just real quickly about why we should trust in God. And here it is. Now, David's been saying, hasn't he? He's my fortress. He's my strength. He's my tower. He is the one I put my trust in. I don't put my trust in man, no matter who the man is, whether he's a humble person or a man in high position. His lies are pretentious. His words mean nothing. In fact, he's nothing. Now, what he'll say then in verse 11 and 12 is this. God has spoken twice to me. In other words, God had spoken twice to David. And notice the first thing that is said, that the power belongs to God. Now, there's a lot of things we could say about that, couldn't we? Because David is a king and he's in position of power, but he remembers that the power really is God. It's not the power of the throne, it's not the power of his position, but all the power. But then again, just think about this. God, who created the heavens and the earth and the universe and everything that is in him, he has all the power. He has power over everything. And so you put your trust in the one who has all power. Then notice again, you put your trust, and here's an interesting thought, isn't it? You put your trust in him because he's merciful. Now, for those of you who have failed and have struggled with sin, isn't this an interesting thing, that you can put your trust in God not only because he has the power, but because he has also the mercy to forgive you, the mercy to deliver you, because he has compassion upon you to get you through it. And so now this is a short psalm. He'll talk about in the latter part about how God will deal with the enemies. He'll render every man according to his work, whether that's the enemies or he'll reward you in a positive sense for whatever you've done in his service. So it's a great psalm, and I hope that you're going through with me in this journey, because I think it'll bring us closer to God, to where we really trust and have faith and confidence in him. And we learn so much as we read the Psalms, don't we? So that's the lesson tonight, and we'll be pushing forward to Psalm 63 tomorrow at 12 noon.